It began with a simple question, the kind of thing I must have asked her 100 times before without giving it much thought. One of those everyday inquiries couples toss back and forth like it's nothing. We had just settled down at the table, plates of grilled chicken and roasted vegetables between us, when I casually said, "Hey, did you remember to pay the credit card bill?" For a second, her fork hovered midair. She didn't respond right away, which struck me as odd. Usually, she'd either give a quick yes or no or maybe even toss it back at me with, "Did you?" But this time, there was something different about the pause. Her hand slowly lowered the fork to the plate, and she fixed her eyes on me in a way that sent an uneasy shiver down my spine. "Why do you always do this?" she snapped, her voice sharper and louder than I'd expected. "Do what?" I asked, genuinely thrown off. "This." She flung her hand toward the table like it was obvious. "Act like I need to report to you, like you're my boss or something. I'm not your puppet." Her words felt like a slap, but I kept my face calm. Inside, though, it was like a dam had burst. It wasn't just what she said, it was the way she said it. There was something buried in her tone, something deeper that had clearly been building for a while. Maybe I hadn't noticed it. Or maybe I didn't want to. "I wasn't checking on you," I replied evenly, leaning back in my chair. "I was just asking about a bill." Her face flushed as she shook her head in frustration. "This isn't about the bill," she said, her voice rising. "It's about how you make me feel, like I can't handle things on my own. Like you're always there to step in and fix everything before I even have a chance. Do you know how suffocating that is?" Suffocating. That word cut deeper than I'd care to admit. It wasn't the first time I'd heard something like that, but I'd always brushed it off. This time, though, she wasn't just annoyed. She was furious. I took a slow breath, trying to keep the situation from spiraling out of control. "I wasn't trying to take over or anything," I said carefully. "I just didn't want us to forget something important." She let out a bitter laugh. "And that's exactly the problem," she said, her voice laced with sarcasm. "You always feel like it's your job to make sure everything goes smoothly. You swoop in, take charge, and leave me feeling like I'm just a passenger in my own life." The silence that followed was heavy, the kind that presses down on you like a weight. I didn't know how to respond, so I stayed quiet, which, looking back, probably made things worse. She poked at her food, barely eating, while I sat there replaying her words in my head. Each time, they hit a little harder. After a while, she stood, picked up her plate, and walked to the sink. "I'm done," she muttered, her back to me. "Done with dinner or the conversation?" I asked, my tone softer but still carrying a hint of sarcasm. She didn't answer. She just rinsed her plate and disappeared into the bedroom without another word. I stayed at the table for a long time, staring at the half-finished plates and wondering how things had gotten to this point. Was she right? Had I been too controlling? Or was this just an overreaction to a harmless question? The thought lingered as I cleaned up the dishes, her words echoing in my mind like an unwanted guest. "I'm not your puppet." That line stuck with me, gnawing at the edges of my thoughts. I understood her need for independence, that much was clear. But the way she framed it, like I'd somehow stolen some essential part of her freedom, felt like an accusation I didn't know how to handle. When I finally crawled into bed, the tension in the house was so thick it felt like I was wading through it just to lie down. She was already turned away from me, either asleep or pretending to be, her breathing steady and even. I stared at the ceiling, too restless to close my eyes, trying to untangle what this meant for us. For me. Because whether she realized it or not, her words had struck a nerve. Deep down, I couldn't ignore the nagging thought that maybe, just maybe, she had a point. The next morning, the house felt unnervingly quiet. She moved through her usual routine like nothing had happened the night before, but the air between us still buzzed with unresolved tension, like a storm just waiting to break. Her tone was calm, almost casual, when she asked, "Do you want some coffee?" but she didn't look at me. I declined, instead watching her as she moved around the kitchen. Her words from last night still echoed in my head: suffocating, puppet, passenger. Those weren't the kind of accusations you threw out on a whim. If that's how she really felt, then maybe I'd been blind to something bigger. And if she truly needed the space she'd been asking for, then fine, I'd give it to her. It wasn't anger driving me, though, or even hurt. It was something colder, a deliberate determination. I wanted to test her words, to see if this was really about independence or if there was something more to it. But I wasn't planning to make a scene, no dramatic speeches or ultimatums. Just quiet, deliberate changes. She left for work first, as she usually did, and I stayed behind, sipping my coffee and mentally reviewing the rhythms of our daily life. A bill was due that day, one I'd normally take care of without a second thought. But this time, I left it alone. She knew the due date as well as I did. If independence was what she wanted, she'd manage it. My first chance to put this plan into action came sooner than I expected. That evening, when she got home, she casually mentioned the water heater acting up again. Normally, I'd have been halfway to the garage for my tools before she even finished talking. But this time, I stayed where I was. "Maybe you should call someone to take care of that," I said, keeping my tone as neutral as I could. Her head tilted slightly, her eyebrows knitting together in brief surprise. "I thought you'd just fix it," she said. I shrugged. "Figured you might want to handle it this time." There was a pause, longer than felt comfortable, before she nodded slightly and left the room. Later, I overheard her calling a plumber, her voice brisk and to the point. She got it done. Over the next few days, I started stepping back in ways that felt awkward and unnatural. The little things I'd always taken care of, filling up the car, grabbing groceries, calling the bank to clear up a minor issue, I left them to her. She handled every one of them, but not without comments or looks that hinted at her growing irritation. It all came to a head one evening when she finally confronted me. "Is something going on?" she asked, her tone more curious than accusatory. "You've been different lately." I kept my eyes on my laptop, trying to sound casual. "I thought it might be good to take a step back," I said. "You mentioned not wanting me to micromanage, so I figured I'd give you some space." Her expression flickered, her emotions momentarily breaking through. But she didn't press me. "Right," she murmured before turning back to her phone. Privately, I couldn't help keeping score. Every forgotten detail, every small inconvenience she had to handle herself, seemed like proof that she wasn't as ready for this independence as she thought. But instead of feeling vindicated, I just felt empty. Each little victory only seemed to widen the gap between us. The breaking point came later that week. She came home looking completely drained, her shoulders slumped as she dropped her bag by the door and kicked off her shoes. "The car insurance payment bounced," she said, her voice tight with exhaustion. "I thought you handled that." I didn't even look up. "Nope. The account details are in the folder. You can take care of it." She stared at me, her mouth half open, like she wanted to argue but couldn't find the words. After a moment, she shook her head and walked to the kitchen without another word. I could hear her muttering under her breath as she rifled through the folder, eventually finding the papers she needed. Sitting there, listening to her grumble about account numbers and the frustration of dealing with customer service hold times, I started to question myself. Was I proving a point, or was I just setting her up to fail? That night in bed, the silence between us felt heavier than ever. It wasn't just about the lack of conversation, it was in the way we moved around each other. Every step, every glance felt calculated, careful, like we were strangers trying to coexist in the same space. The quiet was suffocating, but I wasn't ready to break it. She wanted her independence, and I was determined to give it to her, even if it meant costing us both more than we'd bargained for. The next morning, the air between us was colder still. She moved through her routine with an almost mechanical precision, every motion clipped and deliberate. I could tell she was determined not to let the tension crack her resolve, or at least not to let me see it. As for me, I stayed the course, sticking to my quiet experiment. She wanted control, so I would let her have it. It didn't take long for the cracks in our new routine to show. The trash in the kitchen was piling up, something I would have normally taken care of without a second thought. This time, I left it alone. She noticed. I saw her glance at the overflowing bin as she grabbed her coffee mug, her lips pressing into a tight, thin line. But she didn't say a word. Instead, she walked out the door, leaving it exactly as it was. Later that day, a text came through. "Did you pay the internet bill? It's due today." I stared at the screen for a moment before replying. "Nope. Folders in the kitchen. You've got it." Her response was short, almost clipped. "Fine." When she got home that evening, I could see the strain etched across her face. She tossed her bag onto the couch, opened her laptop, and immediately dove into a list of tasks I would have normally handled before they even crossed her mind. I stayed out of the way, watching as she tried to juggle everything. Seeing her like this, tired, frustrated, and clearly struggling, was strange. Part of me felt justified, even vindicated. But another part of me was uneasy. Was this what I really wanted? To watch her flounder. The first real test came when she realized the pantry was nearly empty. Normally, I would have stocked it up over the weekend without a word. This time, I hadn't touched it. As she rummaged through the cabinets, the irritation in her movements was impossible to miss, the slam of a cupboard door, the clatter of a cereal box being shoved aside. "We're out of milk," she finally said, her voice tight with frustration. "Yeah, I noticed," I replied evenly, keeping my tone casual. "Figured you'd want to handle the shopping this week." Her eyes narrowed, and for a moment, I thought she might argue. But instead, she grabbed her keys, muttered something I couldn't make out, and walked out the door. An hour later, she came back, her arms full of grocery bags. She didn't say a word, but her silence spoke volumes. The days stretched on like that, each one thick with tension. She was managing everything, but the strain was starting to show. The car was running on fumes. Laundry stayed in the hamper longer than usual. Bills piled up on the counter, unopened and waiting. It was clear she wasn't used to juggling it all, and it showed. But she didn't ask for help, not once. One evening, I found her at the dining table, surrounded by papers and with her laptop open in front of her. She was squinting at the screen, her fingers hesitating over the keyboard as she muttered under her breath. It was a bill, something she never would have had to worry about before. "Need help?" I asked, keeping my tone calm and distant. She looked up at me, her expression a mix of exhaustion and defiance. "No," she said quickly. "I've got it." I nodded and walked away, but as I left the room, I heard her sigh. It wasn't a sound of defeat. It was frustration, the kind that comes with realizing just how much effort it takes to keep everything running smoothly. That night, as I lay in bed, the day's events kept looping in my mind. She was managing, barely, but it was wearing her down. The confident, self-assured woman I had married was now buckling under the weight of responsibilities she hadn't anticipated. Yet, even as the cracks showed, she refused to acknowledge them. The house began to change in subtle but noticeable ways. Tasks I used to handle seamlessly, almost invisibly, now stood out in their absence. The overflowing trash can. The floors that hadn't seen a vacuum in days. The dishes piling up in the sink. Each one felt like a quiet reminder of the space I had intentionally left behind. She was trying to keep up, I could see that, but her efforts were patchy at best. Still, I said nothing. I let her figure it out. After all, wasn't this what she wanted? Independence. Freedom. A chance to prove she wasn't my puppet. But as the days dragged on, a nagging thought began to creep in: was she trying to prove something to me, or was I the one trying to make a point to her? The line between the two was starting to blur, and I wasn't sure which side of it I was on anymore. At first, the unraveling of our routine was subtle, almost imperceptible. But those small cracks gradually deepened into gaping fissures, and the tension between us seeped into every part of our lives. I stayed firm in my decision to step back, but I hadn't anticipated how far the ripple effects would go, or how much they would cost us. The breaking point came one afternoon when I noticed her pacing in the living room, her phone clutched tightly in her hand. There was a look on her face I knew all too well, frustration thinly veiled by determination. I didn't ask what was wrong, but I caught bits of her conversation as her voice grew sharper, more agitated. Something about our joint insurance policy. When she finally hung up, she threw the phone onto the couch and let out an exasperated sigh. "Why didn't you respond to the emails from the insurance company?" she demanded, her voice teetering on the edge of accusation. "What emails?" I asked, keeping my tone deliberately casual. "The ones about renewing our car insurance," she snapped, her frustration boiling over. "They've been sending reminders for weeks." "I figured you'd take care of it," I replied simply. Her eyes widened, a mix of disbelief and anger flashing across her face. "You always handle this stuff. Now they're saying the policy expired, and I have to figure out how to reinstate it. We're being charged extra fees because we missed the deadline." I shrugged. "You've got their number. It shouldn't be too hard to sort out." The color drained from her face, leaving only a mask of shock and fury. "You're unbelievable," she muttered, snatching her laptop and storming off to the dining table. From across the room, I could hear her typing furiously, her frustration palpable in the sharp clicks of the keyboard. The next hour became a symphony of clipped phone calls and the relentless rhythm of her typing. Our insurance was something I'd always handled, streamlined, organized, practically automatic. Watching her stumble through it from scratch made it painfully clear how much I had smoothed over without her ever needing to notice. Eventually, she slammed her laptop shut and marched into the kitchen. "This isn't independence," she said, her voice trembling with anger. "This is sabotage. You're setting me up to fail." "I'm not sabotaging you," I replied, meeting her glare. "I'm giving you the freedom you wanted." Her laugh was bitter and hollow. "Freedom? This feels more like punishment." I stood up, leaning against the doorway as I locked eyes with her. "You said you wanted control, so I stepped back. You can't have it both ways." Her jaw clenched, and she looked away, her shoulders rigid with tension. "You don't get it," she said, her voice quieter now. "You're just sitting there, letting me clean up the mess you left behind." "It's not my mess," I said evenly. "It's our mess. I'm just not the one fixing it anymore." And just like that, the conversation ended. But the silence that followed was louder than anything we could have said. Eventually, she went back to her laptop, her determination burning as brightly as her exhaustion. She was resolved to figure it out on her own, but the toll it was taking on her was impossible to miss. That evening, she barely said a word to me. The weight of everything we were going through was etched clearly on her face, and for the first time in days, I felt a pang of guilt. Watching her struggle wasn't satisfying, it was uncomfortable. But I convinced myself it was necessary. This was about balance, about proving a point. Or at least, that's what I kept telling myself. By the time the insurance issue was finally resolved, the cost was written all over her. She looked completely drained, her usual confidence shaken. She went to bed without a single word, and I stayed behind in the stillness of the living room, replaying the events of the day over and over. For the first time, I started to wonder if I'd taken this too far. I wanted her to have the independence she'd asked for, but was this what it was supposed to look like? The cracks in our relationship weren't just affecting her anymore, they were creeping into me, too. And yet, I didn't know how, or even if, we could begin to fix them. Days of unspoken frustration and deliberate avoidance had built a wall so thick that even our smallest interactions felt forced. I kept waiting for her to say something to break the cycle, but she didn't. And I wasn't about to make the first move either. We were both too proud, too stubborn to admit that the distance between us was growing wider with every passing day. Then, one evening, everything came crashing down. It started harmlessly enough. She came home late, her shoulders slumped in a way that told me work had been rough. I looked up from where I was sitting on the couch with my laptop and noticed she was carrying takeout bags, something she rarely did. Normally, she insisted on cooking, even when she was exhausted, like it was her own quiet act of defiance. But not tonight. She set the bags on the counter with a sigh, her eyes landing on the stack of unopened mail sitting next to them. "Have you at least gone through this?" she asked, gesturing at the pile with a tired wave of her hand. "No," I replied evenly. "I figured you'd handle it." Her head snapped up, and for the first time in days, her eyes locked onto mine. "Seriously?" she said, her tone sharp and cutting. "How long are you planning to keep this up?" I closed my laptop, leaning back on the couch as I met her glare with a calm I didn't entirely feel. "Keep what up?" I asked, though we both knew exactly what she meant. "This." She shot back, her voice rising. "This thing you're doing, acting like some detached observer while everything around us falls apart." "I'm not acting," I said simply. "I'm giving you the space you wanted." Her laugh was bitter, devoid of humor. "Space?" she repeated, shaking her head in disbelief. "That's what you're calling it?" "No, this isn't space. This is you walking away from everything because I dared to say I didn't want to feel like a puppet." "Walking away?" I countered, my voice firming. "You told me you wanted independence, so I've done exactly that. I've given you what you asked for." She took a step closer, her hands clenched tightly at her sides. "You're not giving me independence," she said, her voice trembling with anger. "You're punishing me. You're sitting back, watching me drown, and somehow convincing yourself you're being noble." Her words hit harder than I wanted to admit, but I didn't let it show. "I'm not punishing you," I replied, keeping my tone measured. "I'm showing you what happens when I step back. You said you felt suffocated, fine. Now you're in control. But control comes with responsibility." Her eyes burned with frustration, and for a moment, I thought she might fire back with something sharp. But instead, she turned away, gripping the edge of the counter as if she needed it to steady herself. When she spoke again, her voice was lower, but the intensity in her words hadn't dimmed. "You don't get it, do you?" she said, her tone laced with frustration. "You've spent so much time holding all the control that you can't see what it feels like to have everything dumped on you all at once. That's what I've been dealing with for years." I fired back, "And you think it's been easy for me? Carrying the weight of everything, making sure the bills are paid, the house is running, and your life stays as smooth as possible. You didn't even notice how much I handled, because you never had to." She spun around to face me, her cheeks flushed with anger. "You think I didn't notice?" "Of course I noticed. But I didn't ask you to take on everything, you decided that on your own. And then you held it against me." "I didn't resent you," I said, but even as the words left my mouth, they felt hollow. I didn't know how to say no. And now, when I try to step back, this is what happens." She stared at me, and for a moment, her expression shifted. Beneath the anger, there was something else, something I couldn't quite identify. "This isn't stepping back," she said, her voice steady but sharp. "This is tearing everything down just to make a point." The room fell into an uneasy silence, the kind that seemed to echo in every corner. For the first time in weeks, I felt the weight of what we were doing to each other. This wasn't just about bills or household chores anymore. It was about the foundation of our entire relationship. And that foundation was beginning to crack. She shook her head, her frustration palpable, and walked away, leaving the takeout bags untouched on the counter. I stayed in the living room, my eyes fixed on the spot where she had stood, her words looping in my mind, tearing everything down to prove a point. Was that what I'd been doing? Was I so intent on making her see things from my perspective that I'd lost sight of the bigger picture? Whatever my intentions had been, this didn't feel like balance anymore. It felt like destruction. And I wasn't sure how much more either of us could handle. That night, she retreated to the bedroom without another word, her footsteps echoing faintly as she walked away. I remained in the living room, staring at the unopened takeout bags like they were some monument to the tension that had consumed us. The house felt heavier than ever, burdened by everything we'd said, and everything we hadn't. I sat there for hours, replaying the argument in my head. Her words lingered, "This isn't stepping back. This is tearing everything down to prove a point." Had I gone too far? Was this all part of some misguided attempt to teach her a lesson? Or was this simply the fallout of years spent on autopilot, resentment simmering just beneath the surface? The next morning, the silence in the house was deafening. She was already gone by the time I woke up, and her absence hit harder than I'd expected. The kitchen, once alive with the comforting hum of brewing coffee and the chatter of hurried mornings, now felt empty, sterile and lifeless. As I poured myself a cup of coffee, something caught my attention. On the kitchen table was a neatly stacked pile of papers, bills, account statements, and a notebook with her familiar handwriting scrawled across its pages. Sitting on top of the pile was a sticky note. "Can we go through these together tonight?" I stared at the note for a long time, and something inside me began to shift. It wasn't an apology, and it wasn't defiance either. It was a gesture, a small but meaningful step towards something better. For the first time in weeks, I felt my resolve begin to crack. When she came home that evening, she looked worn out but determined. Her shoulders were tense, but there was no sharpness in her tone. As she stepped into the kitchen and saw me sitting at the table with the stack of papers in front of me, she stopped and hesitated. We just sat there for a moment, looking at each other, neither of us quite sure how to begin. Finally, she took a seat across from me, her expression cautious but tinged with hope. "Thanks for sitting down with me," she said quietly, her voice steady but softer than usual. I nodded. "I think it's time we did this." We started working through the mess together, sorting the stack of papers, dividing tasks, and clarifying what needed to be done. At first, the conversation stayed purely practical, due dates, account numbers, and balances. But as the evening stretched on, something began to shift. "I didn't realize how much you were managing," she admitted, flipping through a particularly confusing bill. There was a hint of regret in her tone. I thought I had a sense of it, but I didn't. I hesitated, unsure how to respond at first. "I didn't realize how much pressure I was putting on you either," I said eventually. "I thought I was helping, but maybe I wasn't." She glanced up at me, her expression softening. "I never wanted you to feel like you had to take everything on," she said gently. "I just wanted to feel like I had a voice in how things were done." "And I never wanted you to feel like your independence didn't matter," I replied. I didn't know how to step back without feeling like I was failing. The honesty hung between us, raw and vulnerable. For the first time in weeks, it felt like we weren't talking at each other anymore, we were talking to each other. The conversation wasn't easy, and it wasn't pretty. We said things that hurt, truths we'd been avoiding for years. But as hard as it was, it felt like something we needed to do. Little by little, we began piecing together a new understanding of what our relationship needed to look like. Not one where one of us carried the other, but one where we shared the weight equally. When we finally finished sorting through the bills, she reached across the table and placed her hand over mine. It wasn't an apology exactly, but it was something better, an acknowledgement, a sign that we were starting to see each other again. "I don't want to keep fighting like this," she said softly. "Neither do I," I replied. "But if we're going to move forward, we have to figure out how to do it together." She nodded, And for the first time in what felt like forever, I caught a glimpse of the partnership we used to have. It wasn't a perfect resolution, not by a long shot. There was still a long road ahead. But for the first time, it felt like we were both willing to walk it. That night, as we went to bed, the silence in the house felt different. It wasn't the stifling, bitter silence that had hung over us for weeks. This silence was gentler, the kind that comes when two people have finally started to hear each other. For the first time, I let myself believe that maybe, just maybe, we'd find our way back.